All right. Welcome to Standing for Truth, everybody. We are excited to have Professor David McQueen back here with us tonight. Since we always have so many great questions coming in from you guys every single week during every single show, what we thought would be a great idea would be to have a 2-hour audience Q&A. That's right, Professor McQueen. So we got a lot of questions. And I want to point out, though, in the chat, we have compiled a lot of questions from previous shows, questions that came in through email. But please tag me with any questions you guys may have in the live chat, and we will definitely do our best to get to those, as we have 2 hours roughly of Q&A. Now, I will say this before we get into the actual questions and answers. I am going to hand it to Professor McQueen and George for some introductions into the topic that I think we'll be spending most of the time answering questions about. So that being said, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here.
So glad to be here. I hope you're well today, George.
No worries. Before we start, I just got to do something. Hold on a second.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much.
Happy birthday to you.
That's a beautiful voice, George.
It is. For the record, I turned 69 years old last week. So I am, according to my insurance company, 6 years from death. So I got plenty of time to deal with Standing for Truth.
You look good, Professor McQueen. You look good. Happy
you.
Birthday, brother.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. What George and I and Standing for Truth have decided is we're going to divide this section into 4 30-minute segments. I'm going to introduce a topic that I think would be worth talking about for 5 minutes. Then George is going to do the same. And we're going to cycle that through all of the 4 segments. We'll take the ordinary break at 1 hour, and George and Standing for Truth will take over from there. I want to begin my first 5-minute cycle with a quote from an unlikely source. Buddha, old Buddha said, 3 things cannot long remain hidden: the sun, the moon, and truth. And so, even though I'm not a follower of Buddha, what he says is true. Even though I'm not a follower of Charles Darwin, I'm a Darwin denier. I am a young earth creationist. But that doesn't mean that everything that Darwin said in his book is untrue. When he talks about his ability to find worms in the soil as he wandered aimlessly in Scotland near the University of Edinburgh, and he was fascinated by these worms and counted them and so forth. You know, he's got that in his book, and that's a true statement. The kicker comes at the end. So behind me, you'll see the latest proverb that Ms. McQueen's going to put on a pillow for me. Skeptical versus in denial. I'd like the Standing for Truth audience at the end of this 2 hours, when they hear questions from people that are critics of a young earth, a worldwide flood, a attitude of truth for the Bible, I want you to determine, are they being skeptical or are they actually in denial? My friend George has taught me over the last 6 months the word rescue device. If I move my head this way, you see the National Geographic depiction of a sea that moved up through the North American continent and the dinosaur trackways that moved from south to north. Now, as a creation scientist, as someone that has a copy of Dr. Clary's new book about flood geology and a copy of Dr. Andrew Snelling's 2-volume work on flood geology, I certainly believe that there really is a trackway going from Mexico all the way up into Canada. And that's where you find the dinosaur footprints. For example, in Texas, these footprints are famous going all the way back to the 1950s. South of Fort Worth, Texas, in a river called the Paluxy River. So I don't deny that they're footprints. I'm skeptical about how those footprints were formed. And Standing for Truth has reminded us week after week that the purpose of Standing for Truth is to encourage skeptical, honest inquiry. What I worry about is my new friend Erica, love her glasses. I've been wearing glasses since I was 10 years old. This is Erica that was hit in the gut by the gibbon, apparently. Is she skeptical or is she in denial? I'm not being harsh because I've got daughters your age, Erica. Just listen up. Okay, George, that's my 5-minute intro. How about you?
Yeah. Look, last week when we spoke about this question and answer session, I thought to myself, 2 hours, crikey, to use an Australian term, crikey, 2 hours is a drop in the ocean, but we'll try our best. So I'll start off with my usual quote here. May the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light, your ears to the truth, and your heart to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Amen. Now, I think in Isaiah 54:13 it says, and all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. Unfortunately, we hear today some disturbing things that kids are being taught at school. And I shudder to think, I think Satan is behind it. Unfortunately, many of the teachers have lost their faith and turning our children away. But yeah, David, on the topic, I thought in case we don't get questions from the audience, I'll read some of the anti-young Earth creationist papers and
Good idea.
refutations. And I thought I might get some of those questions and we can cover them. Not that they haven't been covered before, but your point about skeptical versus in denial is right on the ball, by the way. These people are unbelievable.
Well, George, go ahead and kick our time off. Ask the first question, and then we'll go to Standing for Truth for questions from the audience. What's your first question, George?
Oh, okay, my one. All right. Just bear with me while I've got to get to my point now.
Yes, no problem. I'm just showing some of my teaching tools that I brought today.
I'm just scrolling through.
That's a big short tooth.
Heap of information. Okay, question 1. According to the young Earth creation science model, all the fossil-bearing rock layers in the world need to be created during the flood of Noah. Fossils in ancient rock layers imply that death occurred before the fall of man, which is contrary to their interpretation of Scripture. Now, I look at it the other way. It's the old Earth creationists that have got the problem. They have the problem of death before sin, so they have to explain why Jesus died if there was death before sin.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And let me answer that with my models that I have borrowed, or depending on which grandchild you're talking to, stolen from their toy box. Notice that there's red, blue, and yellow. Let's say that the red are the rocks that were created by God on the first and the third day of creation. these rocks, since the Bible is true. Now, notice how I said that. We at Standing for Truth believe that the Bible is a reliable historical document, so that when we hold up a Bible such as this is Dr. Henry Morris's commentary on the Bible. We believe that this is a trustworthy historical document. So when in Genesis it says that God created on that first day and third day, since there was no death in the world, these rocks, what petroleum geologists call the basement, what old earth, deep time people call Precambrian, these are rocks without fossils. And if I move my head over, these are the rocks that form the basis of the craton of North America. A place that I've been is Sudbury in Ontario, Canada. And if you go north of Sudbury, you find all kinds of rocks without fossils. Our argument within flood geology is that the floodwaters hit, and those floodwaters began to pile up rocks during the 6 months of the flood. Traditionally, on maps of geology, blue stands for limestone. So I'll change the order. All over the earth, in England, in Wales, in North America, in Germany, in Northeast Africa, you find sandstones, clastics, on top of the basement rocks. And then you have limestones above that. In the Grand Canyon, my finger would be pointing to the Tapeat sandstone, and then as you go up, the Red Wall limestone. So we find this sequence of sandstone followed by limestone all over the earth. So our argument, George, to your question there, is that, whoops, dropping my toys there. Flood geologists have a perfectly reasonable alternative to a deep time model, which we do not believe is a rescue device. We believe that it's a straightforward interpretation of what you see: Precambrian rocks, sandstones deposited on top of that. Okay, Standing for Truth, let's go to an audience question now.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. Here we go. Here's a fun question from One Cow Stampede. Thank you for your question. Question for Professor McQueen. What are some of your top-rated books on flood geology and catastrophism?
Okay, let's make a list of 3 that you should buy between now and Christmas. You certainly need a copy of Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Whitcomb's book called The Genesis Flood. Came out in 1961. It reflects 10 years worth of research and actually 20 years worth of thinking on the part of these 2 men. That's a standard reference. When you read it, you'll say, well, McQueen, they don't talk about plate tectonics in the book. Well, if you go back to my old Geology 101 books from the 60s, they didn't talk about plate tectonics either, so you can't criticize them for that. So the first book is the book, The Genesis Flood. The second book is Dr. Andrew Snelling's 2-volume work. Is it called Catastrophes in Earth History, George? Am I remembering the title correctly?
I'm not sure, David.
I think that's the title of it. But at any rate, it's the only 2-volume work that Andrew Snelling has done, and it's a tremendous overview. And then the third book that you should get between now and Christmas is Dr. Tim Cleary's book from ICR that deals with the application of sequence stratigraphy to flood geology. The very most simple definition that we can use for these 6 parts is above the Creation Week rocks, there's a sequence of 6 rocks, the earliest of which is called the Salk sequence. This is his new word for what the traditional geologists, the old Earth guys, would call the Cambrian, from 600 to 500 million years old. And then it goes up from there. So those are the 3 books. Do you have a book you think I should add to that list, George?
Oh, there's a number of them, by the way. I mean, there's a good book that I just purchased just last week. I took delivery from Steve Austin about the Grand Canyon. And there's also Contested Bones. There's numerous books that cover the subjects really, really well to the greatest detail.
Now, keep in mind that I'm a 20th century guy. I like books. I want to go back in H.G. Wells' time machine to 1968. Of course, it'd be nice to know what I know now then, but you can't do that. God gives you the wisdom for the moment. But there are all kinds of websites and so forth. No group is better than Standing for Truth in keeping track of the different websites like oldearth.org, ICR.org, AIG.org, and so forth. Okay, next question.
Okay, great answer. Great suggestions, Professor McQueen. Question comes in from XDman06. I appreciate it. For McQueen and George, what are some strong arguments for young Earth creation that I can bring up in conversations? I want to spread the truth around my community, so I appreciate any response, and we appreciate the question, XD man.
Okay.
I can answer part of.
Yeah, go ahead and go first, George, and I'll go second.
Okay, well, I actually like the subject of carbon-14 in things like diamonds, coal, and fossils. I was just going through some of my material last night, and there was a conference in Singapore where I think there were 5 or 6 PhD scientists who presented a paper on carbon-14 in fossils. And get a load of this, an hour before the conference, the paper was removed. Even if you try and find that on their website is literally closed. I've got some screenshots. I thought that might come up. I can show those later if people are interested, but they're very scared of the carbon-14 issue. And the other one that's really a no-brainer is the erosion rates. You know, when you consider these are secular, rates that suggest the Earth's landscape would erode to sea level in a mere 10 to 12 million years.
Right.
If that was the case, then the Earth's landscape, even when you take into consideration their rescue device of uplift, would erode over 300 times in that old Earth of 3.5 million years that it took the Earth to cool down, etc.
Yeah.
And the other question is, you've got to ask yourself, if all this erosion has been happening for all these millions of years, why do we still find the fossils? There shouldn't be any fossils.
Exactly.
So go ahead, David.
Yeah. Now, what I thank you for putting that up. Earth's Catastrophic Past is 2009, and then Clary's book was 2020. Thank you for that. I have come up with 3 different 5-minute arguments for flood geology that I call basic, intermediate, and let's go to graduate school. Let me give you my basic 5 minutes that's intended for 10-year-olds. I feel that a great many of the evolutionary opponents on Standing for Truth, if I'm allowed to be a bit critical, function at a 10-year-old level. So why don't we start with them? So Johnny comes in. He's in elementary school here in the U.S., 10 years old. How would I convince him about the flood? Well, I would get a tooth from a megalodon, this huge shark tooth here that is that big. There's a Sharpie for scale. Ms. McQueen was kind to cook me a biscuit. So here's a biscuit for scale. This is a big fossil tooth, Johnny. And when you look at the North American continent, I'll move my head here and put this on the correct side. As you go across the North American continent, you find on top of these rocks without fossils that we'll call the craton in the Appalachian Mountains or the Rocky Mountains, you find on top of these rocks without fossils, you find fossils. Now you generally don't find shark's teeth first in these fossils, but if you go to Tennessee, where I've done field work, or the Grand Canyon, where I've hiked the canyon 5 times in 4 years, if you go down in the canyon to the first rocks that have fossils, you find trilobites. Well, I wonder why you would find trilobites, Johnny. Well, they apparently live on the seafloor, and so as the floodwaters hit and eroded the pre-flood rocks, they began to lay down layer upon layer. This is Play-Doh here, layer upon layer of sedimentary rocks. And so one argument for a global flood is, how come when we walk all across America and all across England and Europe, how come we find millions upon millions of, Johnny, what we call snails or gastropods, what we call clams, pelecypods? How come we find millions of these on top of these basement rocks? And how come when we look at these, Johnny, you know what we always find? I could take you to one of the most famous localities in America, near Cincinnati, Ohio, and I can show you a clamshell that looks kind of like this. There's the top and the bottom, and it's closed. Well, Johnny, if we go with my grandchildren to the beach and look for shells, what do we find on the beach? We find shells of clams that are popped open along this line. And we find those in our modern beaches. But you know what we very rarely find on a modern beach in the Caribbean or near the great fossil, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia? We don't find clamshells that are still together. Why? When the clam dies or is killed, it very quickly loses a muscle that causes it to pop open. How come so many of these fossils in North America and around the world are found closed? This is objective, stratigraphic, paleontological evidence for a worldwide catastrophe. So that's my 5 minutes.
David, if I can add to that,
please.
With the Grand Canyon, if you look at the stratigraphy of the Grand Canyon, you'll notice in the secular model there are layers, missing layers. Some are 1 million, some are 5 million, some 10, some 100, and I think even ones that are 1 billion years. Now, they want you to believe that during that period, there was no erosion, no deposition, but at the same breath, they want you to believe that the tiny Colorado River eroded the entire Grand Canyon in 5 million years. What a rescue device! That is,
yes. And
who would be stupid enough to?
This is exactly what George is talking about. You go to the Grand Canyon, you find what's called knife edge contacts. If the Coconino sandstone was really a beach that migrated over millions of years from the central part of the United States down through the Colorado River Basin and so forth. Where's the beaches? Where's the sand dunes? Where's the undulating contact? It's not there. Why? Because it was laid down in a matter of weeks, not a matter of millions of years. Okay, let's go to our next
I agree.
question here. Donnie, please.
George, did you want me to get another question from the audience, brother, or did you want to grab one of these from the emails we that came in, or what do you recommend?
It's really 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to involve the audience standing for truth. So pick a new one there.
Okay, let's see. So we've got question here from the audience. To what degree, if any, do astral bodies, in brackets, we have moon, planets, comets, impact geologic events like earthquakes?
I'll go first since I happen to have a photograph of the moon here. Creation science has studied the moon for years and years, and it turns out that the creation science group, even back in Dr. Morse's days in the 50s, was aware of the controversy as to whether the craters that you see on the moon are the result of impact or volcanic activity. From the Apollo missions, we have data which shows that there were impacts, and then the dark areas that you see, I've got my finger on here someplace. So hard to do this as a mirror image. The mares that in Galileo's day were thought to be seas are actually lava flows. So there's evidence of impacts here. If I were able to turn this photograph of the moon from the near side to the far side, you would see that the far side of the moon, and this is something we didn't know until Apollo in the 1960s and 70s, is tremendously cratered, huge number of craters. My former boss, Bob Gentry, has a theory that the worldwide flood was actually a solar system-wide catastrophe, so that there were meteorites, and I'll use this Plato here as an example of a huge meteorite that comes in and hits the moon and craters it, but some of them go past the moon and end up having an impact on Earth. And that impact structure is technically called an astrobleme, or an evidence of a meteorite impact. On the map of Canada behind me here, let's see if I can get my pen right on it. You have Hudson Bay right in this area. In the southern end of the Hudson Bay, there's a remarkable circular structure. Is it your understanding, from what you know standing in for truth, about the geology of Canada, that they view that as a impact area there at Hudson Bay?
Yes. Yes.
And so some of these came into the earth and affected it. George, let me turn it over to you for your response.
I'm sorry, David. I was searching for your next question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Let's go on to the next question then, and
It comes from an old Earth creationist. That website that you mentioned.
Yes.
They say that one of the problems that the young Earth model encounters in the Grand Canyon is the Coconino sandstone. Now, he states that geologists have stated that this formation of 315 feet thick sandstone was created by a desert environment and is a deposition of wind-deposited sand dunes. The problem for young Earth creation science is that this rock layer is topped by two other fossil-bearing marine rock layers, the Torreweep limestone and the Cobab limestone. This presents a problem to the young Earth model because of the sandstone originated by wind. Then obviously, he says, it could not have been produced by Noah's flood. Before you answer, Professor, can I ask Standing to share my screen, because I think this is a pertinent explanation to why his presupposition is incorrect.
Yes, I want you to go ahead.
Definitely, brother. Yeah, I can share your screen. And as you're doing that, I want to point out to the live chat that they're doing a great job tagging me with all their questions. We've got so many great questions flying in. So guys, continue doing that. Any questions pertaining to the topic, please tag me. So this has been a lot of fun so far. So that being said, George, your screen is shared, brother.
Well, that photo in itself dispels the notion that it was wind deposited sand. And I'll leave the rest of the explanation to Professor McQueen regarding that particular question.
Yes. Let's go back to it and show the value of creation research. In the mid-1980s, I had a graduate student, John Whitmore. He actually came to our house in California and had Thanksgiving with us, and we went out to my garage and we looked at stratigraphic sequence that I put together over the years. Well, John Whitmore, when I left ICR to get a degree in science education, became Steve Austin's student. And John Whitmore has done his research, and now he's got a doctorate and is a professor in the Midwest here in America. And John Whitmore has studied the Coconino sandstones. We'll let again, yellow is the standard color on a geologic map for a sandstone. He studied this, and our critics at places like oldearth.org are simply wrong. The evidence from a detailed study of stratigraphy and sedimentation. Now, let's make sure you understand the words here. Layer upon layer of rock, that's a study of stratigraphy. How the sand grains moved in a column of water, that's called sedimentology. It is true that if you go to the Grand Canyon and you look at the Coconino, above the Coconino is a limestone traditionally depicted by blue. If you look at the Coconino sandstone from the south rim of the Grand Canyon, it's a very prominent and obvious 300 foot or 100 meter thickness of rock that's all over the canyon. Well, what we would teach or what we would observe when we went in those days is the knife edge contacts that you see with my grandchildren's blocks here. You look across and you don't see the claim, or you don't see any evidence for the claim that this Coconino sandstone was a beach that moved slowly over millions of years through this part of the Western United States. No, not at all. It's there's no see, how can I say this most clearly? Okay, let's use this. So George and I take a vacation in Florida. We go out to the beaches in eastern Florida, for example, and we stand there as the sun is setting, and we just watch the sun come in. Well, as we walk in the sand, the next wave washes away that footprint. And what we find, and I'll use the green here, in the United States, we call these sand dunes. Do you have sand dunes in Australia, George?
Yes, we do. In what's classified as the driest continent in the world. Yeah, we've got some of them. Yeah.
Okay, so what would our prediction be? George and I would then, it would take about 4 days to drive from Florida to the Grand Canyon, plenty of time to talk. We would expect to be able to see this undulating sand dune kind of contact with the Coconino. But what do we find instead? As they point out, when you go to the Grand Canyon, you've got the rocks without fossils, and you go up through the Coconino, and then above that, you've got a limestone. If you look back in the list of presentations that George and I have put together in the last 6 months, you'll find numerous discussions about this is limestone, remember, the direct precipitation of limestone from seawater. So our argument is the knife edge contact below the bottom of this thing is the floodwaters coming in, not at the beginning, not what's called the Salk sequence of Professor Cleary, but up above that. And then the floodwaters erode the top of this Coconino, and there is the direct precipitation of limestone above it. The evolutionary old Earth idea that you've got to have a gazillion years in order to get limestone and limestone fossils is simply not true. And my former student and Dr. Austin's former student stands on his own now, and his name is Whitmore, and you can find him very easily because in the next International Conference on Creationism, our former student has been appointed as the senior editor of the document. George?
Yeah, David. It's a good time to actually cover one of the other questions that came from Tim Hebel. He says that he says with math it is impossible to move fast enough to the giant amount of sand if it existed in the pre-flood world needed for sediment transport to the Coconino sandstone. I think he's talking about how do you explain using maths that volume of sediment could be moved?
Okay, the way I would do this is, let me think of which part of what I have here would do the best. Do I recall that as a civil engineer, George, you have poured a lot of concrete in your day?
Oh, lots of it.
Supervise the pouring of it.
Yeah,
so
lots and lots of it.
If we have a cement truck this size, and it pulls up to one of your sites there in Eastern Australia, and it spends days and days. Do I recall that cement is bought and sold by the cubic yard?
Well, cubic meter.
Cubic meter, sorry.
Yeah.
International measure here. So you got this cement truck that dumps this, and George is fooled with it routinely. Well, we're not talking about a cement truck size piece. We're talking about a piece. I'll use the Play-Doh again. We're talking about a worldwide tsunami and mud flow of this size. Now, what's this size? I'm saying that enough sand, let me move my head here again, go to the correct side, enough sand to cover the entire province of Ontario, enough sand to cover the entire island of Tasmania, enough sand to cover the combined states of Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia, huge amounts of sand, a gazillion pickup trucks, or rather dump trucks full, brought that sand from the east to the west and deposited it in the Grand Canyon. So the counter argument to old Earth creationists is, no, we don't need a lot of time in the Grand Canyon. We need a lot of water flowing over the Grand Canyon.
And David, the other empirical evidence is I think the U.S. Navy does regular subfloor geological studies to see how this sand is moving, because they actually use those charts to find areas where they can actually park their submarine, if you like. And also, I think in the recent tsunami in Japan, they observed considerable amount of sand dunes laid at the bottom of the ocean. So yes, water can move lots of sand very quickly.
Well, standing for truth, I noticed that we're at the 30-minute mark here. So can I go to my second argument, which I call the intermediate argument, for the evidence for the worldwide flood? Now, I'm assuming that...
actually, before you do, Professor McQueen, I just wanted to point out real quick, we have somebody in the chat apparently by the name of George Bond. So, George, thanks for the super chat, brother. Looks like, Professor McQueen, we are going over to George's house after this broadcast for
That's
pizza.
good.
You're welcome.
If it's Wednesday for me, it's Thursday for him. It would take, I'm going to stop off with Ms. McQueen in Hawaii. I'll be there in 3 days.
I'll wait for you.
I'll be there in a week.
Warm. Okay, so here's my second argument, what I call an intermediate argument. If you've had high school chemistry and you've had high school biology and you've had high school physics rather, how would those three subjects help you to understand the worldwide flood? The way that I'd like to begin with this is with the knowledge that you may or may not have about Charles Darwin. If we go back to Darwin and his famous book that was published in 1859, we can look at Darwin's own book, The Origin of Species, which is better than any sleeping pill that you can buy. If you actually read some of the chapters in there about the details of bird beaks in the Galapagos, for a geologist like me, doesn't take me long to fall asleep. It's just fact after fact. So what's the point of it? Well, the point of it comes in to another man named Paley. Well, it turns out that Brother Paley is someone that you guys should know from our previous discussions. Paley is the very famous scientist that lived in the theologian that lived in the 1800s that said, if you find a watch of this complexity on a beach, there must be a watchmaker. And so if you go out, now I'm speaking to this intermediate group that's about 20 years old. If you go out and look in the Grand Canyon or look near this Cincinnati, or you go up into the area of New York, east of the Adirondack Mountains, you'll find all kinds of fossils. How do those fossils appear? They appear abruptly and fully formed. Dr. Duane Gish, one of my mentors back in the 80s, now passed on. He spent all of the 1970s focused on this argument, abruptly and fully formed. Well, what does that mean? The abrupt side of it means that if you find a trilobite or you find a fish fossil near Devonshire in England, it appears seemingly out of nowhere. You're going up through the stratigraphic record. Let me use the Play-Doh again here. And you find trilobites in the green. You find these fish fossils in the yellow. Well, they appear abruptly. There's no transitional forms in between. That brings it to Dr. Gish's second point, abruptly and fully formed. You don't find dogs or cats that are halfway between a dog or a cat. You don't have dats and all the other combinations, dog and cat. You don't find these transitional organisms. I would argue that one of the evidences for the worldwide flood is the fact that what Darwin predicted simply has not been found. He was optimistic. In his book, he talked about problems with his idea, but he was an optimist. He said, oh, in the next 100 years. Well, 1859, if we add 100 to that, we come to 1959. And I was a boy then, but the professors got together for the centennial of Darwin's Origin of Species. Did they provide evidence for these transitional organisms? No, they came up with ideas that they called the hopeful monster idea, where all of a sudden things just magically appear. Well, now how does this tie in to Darwin's biography, Paley's biography, and mine? Notice that Darwin was born the same year, same day as Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and Darwin enslaved the world by his idea of most favored races. Notice that Darwin was born in 1809. Paley died 4 years previous, but his book, Natural Theology, was published in 1802. It was one of the textbooks that Darwin moved once he flunked out of Scotland, University of Edinburgh, and moved down to Cambridge to get a degree in Bible. It was one of the standard books, and he quotes it in Origin of Species. It was written in 1802. The evolutionary community loves to call it natural theology and kind of make fun of it. Well, notice that there's a second part to the book. Natural theology, or evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity. So Darwin spent his time at the Cambridge University studying about Paley. Well, how does it tie into my life? Notice that Darwin died in 1882. My grandfather, H.H. McQueen, was born a year later in 1883. My dad was born in 1914. I was born in 1952. Darwin is only 4 generations back from me. Now, if we don't stand for truth regarding the worldwide flood, Donnie, I'd ask, not Donnie, but standing for truth, I'd like to ask you, do you think that we might be 4 generations away from apostasy if we don't stand for truth?
I definitely believe so. I think a lot of these end times events that we see in Scripture are very close. I think we're going to experience those possibly in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So there's
on the same topic, David, you often hear the evolutionists will say plants and whatever share similar DNA to humans. For example, bananas share 50% of the DNA with humans. And the question has to be asked then, in terms of transitional fossils, where are the plant animals?
Exactly. And, we spend a lot of time as flood geologists talking about clams, which are plesiopods, snails, which are gastropods. Let's forget all that. Dr. Dwayne Gish always had a funny thing. He would say, how do you get from fish to gish? So as he taught me, I didn't want to be put to one side. So I'd always say, how do you get from Bean to McQueen? And beans bring up paleobotany. You think the evolutionary community has a nightmare when it comes to invertebrate paleontology. Let's go to paleobotany. Oh, yes. Erica, who's been hit in the gut by the gibbon and all the rest. Explain to me where we get pine trees. Did pine trees evolve from ferns? The ferns appear in the rock record, abruptly and fully formed. You can find plant fossils, plant leaf fossils, a 2-hour drive from where I live in northern Louisiana, in some unconsolidated sands that have a leaf that can be keyed out to the species level, George. So these they appear abruptly in the rock record. That's supposed to be, the place I'm talking about would probably be, I don't know, 30 million years old. But the leaf looks exactly the same as an ash or a maple that you can see today. You see the argument, gentlemen?
Yeah. There's an interesting question, David, in the chat. Comes from XDman06. I'm not sure whether Standing can actually put that on the screen, but he actually says, here's something creative for McQueen and/or George. He says, pick two countries and use the country's geography to show evidence for young Earth creation / the flood.
Okay. I'll start, George, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would obviously choose the Western United States. The Grand Canyon is called a monument to catastrophe. Now, the evolutionary community, in every introductory geology textbook that you pull off the shelf, will use the Grand Canyon as an evidence of not only millions, but billions of years. It turns out a correct view of that would be the view of flood geology. Mrs. McQueen's maiden name is MacDonald. And so several years ago, we went to Scotland to find Mrs. McQueen's roots. And if you go to Scotland and go to Edinburgh, then take the train to Inverness like we did. And then we rented a car and drove on the wrong side of the road to an American. And we drove all the way down past Loch Ness and went over to my wife's ancestral home, the Isle of Skye. And as we went that way, we saw, and I collected actually, some of the basement rocks north of what's called the Great Glen Fault, the fault that runs along Loch Ness. I collected igneous rocks there. And then we went over to the Isle of Skye and saw some sediments on top of that. And Ms. McQueen's clan, the MacDonald clan, was the Lord of the Isles, George, I'm pleased to say. They actually control 1/4 of Scotland, the northwest portion. The McQueen clan, there was a debate about some cattle 1,000 years ago, and my clan was captured and subjugated by the MacDonald clan over this debate over whether I had my grandfather had borrowed the cattle or actually stolen the cattle. And so Shirley's MacDonald Museum is in a castle. Mine's in the back room of a bar about 2 hours northeast of there. But we won't go into that. It just shows that if you go to Scotland and look at the very rocks that Lyell worked with, and I was unaware until I studied Darwin's biography that he had gone with Lyell to these localities in Scotland and seen the sedimentary rocks in angular unconformity other. So those are my two countries. What would you pick, George?
Oh, I was just going to pick the Himalayas. I'm going to use secular rates here. They claim that the Himalayas have been rising at 5 millimeters per year over 50 million years. If you do the maths, that's a height of 250 kilometers. But if you use the young Earth creation timeline from the flood to now, which is about 3,250 years times 5 millimeters, you get 16 kilometers. Now the Himalayas are actually 8.8. Oh, there you go. 3,000 times 5. Yeah, so it's 15 kilometers versus 250 kilometers. Which one would you believe? I mean, take into consideration the erosion rates there, and I think you get a closer answer to a young Earth creation model rather than the secular model. And there are other things, but we could go forever. But there's so many other questions. I don't want to concentrate on that particular one for too long.
Standing for Truth, give us our next question there from our audience.
All right. And George is right. We've got a ton of great questions here. So here's an important one that I want to get to before the 1 hour break. So, okay, here it is. Critics acknowledge, Professor McQueen, that yes, catastrophic events do occur. The geologic record shows many examples of rapidly buried items. They'll concede this. But then they point out that the geological record shows many more examples of slow deposition that we cannot explain from the young Earth creation global flood model. How do we best respond to this claim and these examples of slow deposition?
Okay. Let's go back in history and keep in mind that when Charles Darwin in the 1830s was hired by Captain Fitzroy to be the naturalist on the voyage of the Beagle, when he walked on board ship, getting ready for that 5-year voyage, Fitzroy had bought him a brand new geology book called Lyell's Principles of Geology. And in one of the strange twists of Darwin's life, he read the Bible during the first year of the voyage, but he got interested in this book by Lyell about can you really explain geology in the framework of Bishop Ussher's 4004 BC? Now, keep in mind that Darwin was well aware of Ussher's date of 6,000 years from the age of the Earth. And so Lyell said, well, let's go to the east coast of England and let's look at the White Cliffs of Dover that you can see, I'm told, on a clear day from France with some binoculars. And so let's go to the White Cliffs of Dover. And so Lyell had gone there. Darwin, no doubt, had visited there in his life. And many people have looked at these White Cliffs of Dover, which are formed by microfossils. Some people use the word diatomaceous earth. Some people use other words to talk about these diatoms there in the White Cliffs of Dover. And so Lyell argued, well, I've stood there and watched the erosion of those White Cliffs of Dover. It can't be true that Ussher was right. It can't be true that you got this for millions of years. Even Lyell knew that there were catastrophic units within the rock record, so he acknowledged that. But he said, surely the sandstones that I see, and he was aware of the sandstones in the province of Wales that had been visited by geologists all through the 1800s. He was aware that those sandstones in Wales were red. They contained a green mineral called glauconite. They contained trilobites. And so as the professors took their students to this part of Wales, the Reverend Dr. Adam Sedgwick, who was a geology professor during the week and a preacher on the weekend, he would take his children there, not children, adults, university students, and he would say, I'm tired of writing on the board all of these characteristics, trilobites, glauconite, all that. I know in this part of Wales, there was an ancient Celtic tribe called the Cambri. So I'm just going to call these the Cambrian and make my life simpler. And so he taught his students, okay, we're going to go see the Cambrian. So here's a creationist that coins a name that is hijacked by the evolutionary community. Now, notice my question here. We want you to be skeptical, but are you in denial? Let me give you an example of why you might be in denial. Adam Sedgwick taught during the height of the British Empire. We are told that the sun never set on the British Empire. So these students that had walked on top of the Cambrian, where did they go? They went to India, to North America, to Africa. And you know, every time they found a reddish sandstone, like the Rome Shale or the Tapete Sandstone in the Grand Canyon, or I can go into words all over the earth. Every time they found this red sandstone, there would be this green mineral glauconite in it. And if they looked long enough, they'd find trilobites. And so what did they do? They said, oh, I found the Cambrian of the Reverend Adam Sedgwick. So you will go through the geologic column all over the world, and you will find rocks without fossils that are called Precambrian. And then above it, you will find this C with the line over it. You will find the word Cambrian used, not because it's an evidence of slow and gradual, long time in the past kind of stuff. It's found because the Reverend Adam Sedgwick taught a whole generation of geologists, and they said, why do I invent a new word? When I go to Africa, when I go to North America, and I find rocks like this, I'll call them Cambrian. If I find above that fish fossils, like are found in Devonshire, I'll call them Devonian. Carry out some dinner, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. Okay, we're coming up on the 1 hour break there.
David, if I can add something to that slow deposition,
please.
This is an example actually of how geology students pretty much blinkered from doing critical thinking, because there was a recent paper in 2013 that came out. It's titled Experimental Deposition of Carbonate Mud from Moving Suspensions. Okay, I'm just going to read a couple of short excerpts from that paper. It says, nonetheless, there have been suggestions that, just like terrigenous muds, carbonate muds can flocculate and accumulate in high energy environments. They go on to say, although accumulation of carbonate mud is commonly thought to reflect low energy conditions, there have been occasional observations that carbonate muds may also accumulate in the presence of wave and current action. Yes. And just to finish off, it says, it is therefore quite possible that more carbonate muds will be interpreted as high energy deposits once the science behind the concept becomes established. And they finish off by saying, the observations we report suggest that published interpretations of ancient lime muds and derived paleooceanographic conditions may need to be re-evaluated. So for all these years, geology students have been taught slow deposition. And here's a paper that specifically states, yes, it's been observed that they can happen in fast-moving water.
Well, this brings up a challenge for the future. 2 years from now will be 2023. So Standing for Truth and George and I are going to go to the Bahamas in the Caribbean.
I like that.
Wonderful place to go. And on a certain day, we're going to be waiting near the post office there in Grand Bahama Island. And those of you that can come, we hope there'll be 12 of you. We will lead a field trip barefoot into the micrite muds of the Bahamas. And so you can actually walk on the mud. Now, keep in mind that micrite is a type of limestone that solidifies in a smooth gray pattern. In my field work in Israel, in my field work in the Western United States, my home state of Tennessee, I have seen these gray limestones all over the earth. Why? Because they directly precipitated out, just like what we'll be able to walk on in the Bahamas when we go there in 2 years. I'm hoping to take scuba with one of my granddaughters this coming winter, and so we can even snorkel and scuba. I assume that you're a snorkeler, George.
Actually, yeah, I actually have a certificate from Paddy for advanced open water diving. So I am a scuba diver.
Well, good.
So yeah.
I am a very poor swimmer, so it'll be good to have you at my side. Uh, on a bad day, Ms. McQueen thinks about my drowning like a rat in the Caribbean. But on a good day, she wants to keep me around. So we will end this time on a happy, lighthearted note. Could you drop my video now, and I'll take a break, and I'll let George go to his next question without my presence.
Awesome. That was a fantastic first hour, Professor McQueen. Well earned, well deserved break. So, George, it looks like we're going to have to do more of these, because I can't believe how quickly time flies by, because we're at an hour and 9 minutes and we still have 100 questions to get through. So it was definitely a good idea for a show, and we're going to do more of these.
I told you 2 hours is just a drop in the ocean when it comes to question and answers. But while Professor McQueen is out, there are two questions that are actually related to each other, I think. If I can just cite them, it's one question says, isn't the carbon-14 in dinosaur bones the result of contamination from groundwater or recrystallization before it went to the laboratory? And then the third one, which sort of follows on from that, it says, if the carbon-14 in dinosaurs is not from contamination, wouldn't the difference in percentage modern carbon values, even after correction for the flood, mean that the dinosaurs died decades or hundreds of years apart and not in a 1 year global flood? There are a few sort of answers to that. I mean, if you take that as gospel, then I don't know why they rely on carbon dating of archaeological finds and say that proves something, because if it's contamination, then we shouldn't be accepting any of those. This is like a shooting yourself in the foot question. And the other thing is, what they do, they actually find the carbon-14 in the soft tissue of the dinosaur bones, not the actual mineralized part of the bone, which is the outside. So once you get that rock forming on the outside, I don't think it's that easy for carbon-14 to enter the actual soft tissue in there. So yeah, I mean they've done so many tests now on coal, fossils, diamonds, even fossilized wood that supposedly was found in a limestone layer that was, I forget now, but 50, 60, 100 million, I can't remember the number. So even the fossilized wood contains carbon-14. So I don't know, they just keep inventing rescue devices, and their most famous one is this contamination. Well, if that's the case, then forget about any dating of anything, because we know even with isotopes, they're soluble and they could enter specific specimens that you're actually dating. So I don't know how they actually explain all that. I mean, you either accept it or you don't. You can't. There's no two ways about it. You can't say it works for you, but it doesn't work for us.
Right. That's a great response, brother. That's a great response. It's so funny because these same talking points that are put forth by the evolutionists have been debunked over and over again, especially these talking points that you find on this oldearth.org, right? With these skeptics, these critics. And I think the reason why they refuse to debate live is because they know these talking points have been dealt with so thoroughly, they will be exposed for that. So they'd rather just hide behind their blogs, unfortunately, because as these Q&As demonstrate, we have very sufficient answers to even their best so-called problems. There's a question in the chat about whale evolution that we can also ask Professor McQueen a little bit later. But I definitely wanted to cover a few things on that as well, just in case we don't get the opportunity to do so. For one, I think the biggest problem for whale evolution is the small amount of time frame even the evolutionists accept that a land-dwelling animal had to evolve into a whale designed and built for the ocean. Because even in that short amount of time frame, you'd need a massive amount of highly beneficial mutations to reach fixation due to the novelties in that type of large-scale evolution. And right here I have just a few of those examples of novelties. For example, it says, this is clearly demonstrated by looking at the amazing physical features of whales and comparing them with features of its original ancestor. A partial list of these features include enormous lung capacity with efficient oxygen exchange for long dives, a powerful tail with large horizontal flukes enabling very strong swimming, eyes designed to see properly in water with its far higher refractive index and to withstand high pressure. Okay, and I mean, the list goes on and on. For example, nostrils on the top of the head, blowholes, for example. We could have an entire show on this. But one thing that I find funny, too, is one of their lines of evidence is the vestigial pelvis, right? That apparently, you know, this is the ancient leftover remnant of a past ancestor that walked. And yet even that's been overturned, where we have a secular source demonstrating that these so-called whale pelvic bones play a key role in mating. Right here's a quote. Our research really changes the way we think about the evolution of whale pelvic bones in particular, but more generally about structures we call vestigial. As a parallel, we are now learning that our appendix is actually quite important in several immune responses, not a functionally useless structure. When it comes to the so-called whale pelvic bones, we know that they are necessary in reproduction. If these whales didn't have these functional bones, okay, then reproduction would be nearly impossible. And whales wouldn't be having baby whales. So this is necessary. This is functional. So you see how they assume evolution going into this, right? And even their best so-called examples, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus. There's even secularists that doubt a lot of these examples as transitional forms. For example, here, this is the last thing I'll say. Right here, casting further doubt on Ambulocetus as a transitional form, Dr. Gendrich from the University of Michigan has noticed a very crocodile-like feature of Ambulocetus and now doubts its inclusion into the whale lineage and writes, Ambulocetus has its eyes raised up on top of its head in a very strange way, and it is unusually large for an early whale. Maybe it's not, notice this, maybe it's not in the main line of whale evolution, okay? And all their examples right here. All their examples, Rhodocetus, Ambulocetus, Basilosaurus, Pakicetus, it's all based on highly biased artistic representations. And if you look at Pakicetus, okay, years and years ago, that they formerly assumed was a fully aquatic mammal, and look at it now, it's undergone a drastic revision, and now it's just portrayed as an ordinary land mammal. So the point is the evidence and the story is constantly changing, and the story is even more problematic in light of the empirical evidence that comes in more and more every single day. So I wanted to point that out, George. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on that, brother.
Yeah. Wasn't there a recent paper that suggested to get from a hippopotamus to a whale, you need so many different coordinated mutations to get to it. And I think 2 coordinated mutations they determined to be at 40 million years. Now here's the problem. Right. Their secular story says that whales evolved over 9 millions. Well, if you're only getting 2 coordinated mutations that take 40 millions, you need a lot more time than just 9 million years to get a whale from a hippopotamus-like creature.
especially
Well,
when it's a lot easier to break things down due to mutations rather than build
Yeah.
them up.
Yeah.
And even the best beneficial mutations they point to are reductive. So yeah, like you said,
Wow.
even according to their time frame, there's just not enough time to fixate so many. There's a
Wow.
waiting time problem.
While
Professor
getting my cup of coffee, I've been listening to your discussion of whale sex. And for those of you that don't believe that the Holy Spirit had brought the three of us together, I'll venture a story. I was a National Science Foundation graduate fellow at the University of Michigan from 1975 to 77. Dr. Philip Gingrich gave a talk about whale evolution. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about 40 years ago, more than that. In about 1976, he gave a lecture about whale evolution, and he was very prominent about it at that time. He obviously didn't understand that this bone that was considered to be an ancient vestigial pelvis was actually part of what God designed for whales to reproduce. So later on that semester, I went to Dr. Gingrich. He was not my major professor because I was focused on copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver, and rock mechanics and stuff like that. But I went to Dr. Gingrich, and he knew me from being a graduate student. And I said, would you mind taking me to the University of Michigan Natural History Museum and showing me the transitional organisms that you lectured about when you lectured us about whales? And he was a very gracious man, I remember him as being a very reserved man, a very careful scientist. So he took me back in the bowels of the museum, and he opened drawers, and he pulled out fossils. And he said, well, here, McQueen, is one of the transitional organisms for whales. And so he left me alone with the collection. And I looked at it and didn't look like a whale to me. But again, I was trying to be a little bit discreet there at Michigan. So I didn't argue with Gingrich. But if you look especially at the ICR scientist Frank Sherwin, he's got a book called The Ocean Book, and he's got numerous articles which critique Gingrich's work. So I thought I'd throw that in. Back to you now, Standing for Truth, for our next question.
Can I ask Standing a question? Because I think this is right up his alley. It says, doesn't Lanski's experiment prove that evolution is true and that biased creationism is just cherry picking? I got into a conversation or a discussion with someone on a recent YouTube video with an evolutionist about the Lanski experiment, and I cited a number of papers, secular papers, that he wasn't aware of, and he actually thanked me. He thanked me for citing those papers. So, Standing, have you got something to add to that? Or maybe he's gone to the restroom for a while.
Okay, can I take a moment to read the Bible as he comes back?
Yeah.
You know, we're always talking about how we want to stand for truth and be defenders of God's word. Been spending some time in the book of Romans, looking at the arguments that are presented there by Paul. And I think that this is a very important one to read as an argument for, are you self-deceived or are you simply skeptical? Notice what Paul writes here when he talks about in Romans chapter 1, what he calls the guilt of the Gentiles. Dr. Henry Morris calls it that. And I'll read Romans 1, 18, 19, and 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Standing for truth, Pilate asked the question of Christ, what is truth? You see, truth is at the center of this. Let's read on. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to him. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by what is made. And so if we just go look at whale fossils, or we just go walk down the path that George is going to bring up with Standing for Truth when he gets back, what two things can we know about God? Well, we can certainly get an idea of his eternal power and his Godhead so that they might be without excuse. Keep in mind that answering all these questions and spending 2 hours a week on topics like flood geology, for George and for Standing for Truth, we want to go full circle. We want to start with Christ as the creator, realize that sin offended God the Father. Christ came as our Savior, and will come back as our coming King. And so even if you're, as they used to say in the 20th century, the heathen in Africa, we don't need to go to Africa to find heathen. I would imagine there's some heathen in Eastern Australia, George. Is that true? And maybe at some of the universities here in America? Are heathen all gone away?
Oh, lots of that around. I was just reading in the chat about whale evolution. One person brought up a point that he said they found whales with legs. I mean, this is why I call evolution something that's just based on vivid imagination. And I've got a National Geographic news article here that when you actually have a look at it, you have to shake your head and think that it's their presuppositions that lead them to these sorts of conclusions.
Yeah.
Because they need that progression from a mammal with 4 legs to a whale with no legs.
And during the break, Ms. McQueen and I was talking, and she's a retired kindergarten teacher, and she offered a criticism for the three of us. She said, you know, you guys often will take a topic like the coal seams, but you don't give a simple enough answer. And I've pondered that while I was making my coffee. And part of the reason is if I got a block of coal from Australia or from the Appalachian Mountains or the Western United States, I could hand it to a 10-year-old or to a graduate geology student, and they could break it open and they would see plant fossils, and they'd get an idea that this is some sort of modification of plant material. But to work through whether that particular coal seam, and now I'm going to move to the advanced graduate level comments that I promised. If you go to Dr. Steve Austin's PhD, which he received from Penn State the same year that I got my master's from Michigan, 79. If you go to his PhD work, he did this. He went to Kentucky and looked at a very famous coal seam in Kentucky, and he asked the question, is that autochthonous or allochthonous? I'll try to spell those before we end, but the idea of allochthonous is a geologic word which means a lot of movement, allochthonous. Autochthonous means that you had this peat and that coal, 10,000 years of peat, the sphagnum moss built up, and that's how you got the coal. It's in place. It's autochthonous. Well, Austin found evidence that the Kentucky number 12 was allochthonous. It had been moved into place. This gave birth to his idea about floating mats, which he then confirmed when we're talking scuba, George. Dr. Austin in 83, 84, he took scuba so that he and his buddies could dive at the lake formed by the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And so he went down very dangerously underneath all this floating stuff and found something you pointed out in the past, George, that some of those waterlogged trees were standing vertical at the bottom of that lake. So what's the answer to Ms. McQueen's question? There are some simple arguments, like I think I've given a few minutes ago, but there are some things that you simply have to go to graduate school to fully understand. My final point on that is please go back to the debate that I had with the fine fellow in the Eastern United States on this whole issue of the question of whether there could be catastrophic plate tectonics, very rapid catastrophic, very rapid, let's see, what am I trying to say? Very rapid production of heat in the early part of the creation week. Gentry's book, Creation Time Mystery, is one thing you need to do and have on your shelf. We acknowledge, George and I did, that there is additional research that needs to be done about what's called the heat problem, the number of joules of heat that must be dissipated. Creation scientists have acknowledged that we don't understand the second day of creation. Whatever the waters above were, certainly wasn't a vapor canopy, because if it was, when Eve would gather water in her golden bowl, it would boil in the Garden of Eden. You can't have that. You can't have that kind of temperature. And so, as my bosses at ICR always told me, Dr. Morris, Dr. Gish, and the others, when we send you out, we're sending you from the Institute for Creation Research, not the Institute for Creation Answers. Okay, back to you, Standing.
All right, I appreciate that. We got so many good questions in here in the live chat. George, is there any specific one you want me to get to, brother?
Yeah. Standing while you were away, I actually asked one that you probably best qualified to answer. This was about the Lanski's experiment. The question was, does a Lanski's experiment prove evolution? And I mentioned to the audience that I got involved with a couple of people, evolutionists, in a chat on a recent video by Veritasium, I think it's called, where I cited some papers about the citrate, and they weren't aware of those papers, and they thanked me for putting them to them. So they seem to be listening to people that are obviously not telling them everything about the Lanski experiment. And I know you know more about it in terms of fitness loss and whatever. So if you want to spend a couple of minutes just expanding on that.
Sure, yeah. I'll make it quick just so we can get to these geology related questions. But yeah, I mean, I've had debates where I've talked extensively about the Lanski experiment, but it is the largest long-term evolutionary experiment there is. Lanski has many populations of these E. coli bacteria, but it's actually fantastic evidence for genetic degeneration and devolution, because you can read all about them in his papers, but the adaptive episodes that he's observed, they've been relatively due to loss of function, loss of promoter, reductive evolution, in the sense that these bacterial populations, they're losing genes for adaptive purposes, but it's actually long-term degeneration. That's what I mean by reductive evolution. It's kind of like this. If I wanted to get better gas mileage in my car temporarily, well, I could start removing weight, remove the doors, remove the side mirrors, remove the seats. Okay, I'll have better gas mileage for a time, but overall I'm destroying the car, right? So it's short-term adaptation, long-term degeneration. That's all we see in the Lanski experiment. Overall, his bacterial populations over the years, they've actually shrank in functional genome size. They've lost genetic information. These bacteria, there's a new paper in 2021. If you were to put them into another environment, they'd be dead on arrival. they're weak, they're lazy, they're handicapped. So no, Lanski's experiment is not demonstrating large-scale evolution. It's actually demonstrating genetic entropy, genetic degeneration. So it's fascinating evidence for our side, to be honest.
Well, standing for truth, you've taught me something there. I did not know that name, Lanski, and I certainly am aware that the old experiments on Drosophila, the fruit fly,
yeah,
they end up worse off after they're exposed to radiation and they intermarry for 1,000 generations. Thank you for bringing that up.
My pleasure.
Okay, we're at the we're beginning the last 30 minutes, so let's have another question standing for truth for us, please.
Okay, let's go with, well, we've got a super chat that came in from Crimson Air, so I want to get to this one. Thank you so much for the super chat, Crimson Air. His question is, apart from the coelacanth, how many other living fossils are there that are practically identical to the fossil counterparts in spite of deep time?
Okay, if you go to a standard geologic column, and I will get my grandchildren's blocks here, and you go and you look at certain types of invertebrate fossils, plesiopods, gastropods, and they're found very low in the rock record, presumably 600 million years old. I can clearly remember my paleontology professor at Tennessee, 1974 we're talking about here, pretty close to 50 years ago, pointing out that as you go up through the rock record, this little pesky invertebrate appears again and again. And when we take that trip to the Bahamas we've been talking about, we can not go around the micrite mud, well, we can go off the east bank or the west bank, and we can find the same fossil there that is found down at the bottom of the column. Now, the evolutionary community, my professor kind of laughed this off. You know, he said, well, this is a living fossil, but it doesn't matter because nothing ever evolved from the clams. Wait, stop. Nothing ever evolved from the clams? Well, there was a time that there were only clams, plesiopods, gastropods, and you're telling me that over millions of years, with time plus chance and impersonal forces, these clams are going to end up being the descendants of, these clams are going to end up being the gibbons or the Neanderthals or the other creatures that are supposed to evolve into man. So don't dismiss these little fossils that are persistent. If you go back to the paleobotany argument, my major paleontology professor there at Tennessee had a plant growing in his lab that was very much like the same kind of plant that are found in the coal measures, called Carboniferous internationally, and here in America, Mississippi and Pennsylvania. And so these are two examples of living fossils. George, do you have a favorite living fossil yourself?
Yeah, I was going to say it's really amazing that when they do find these fossils and they look alike to something we know today, they always call them like. For example, beaver-like or snake-like.
Yes.
And it's their way of saying it's not really a species that exists today. It was something like a species we see today. But here's something fresh off the press, David. This is dated. This is a Science magazine article dated June the 23rd, 2021. Okay.
Oh, that was yesterday or something.
Yes. And listen to this. The title, I haven't read it yet, but the title of the actual article says, Ancient Siberian Cave hosted, wait for it, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, possibly at the same time.
Yes.
Yes, just yesterday.
Yes, I know the truth of this because when I was in junior high, Coach Brewster, my PE coach back in the 60s, had a prominent brow ridge. And where I grew up, around the seventh grade, that'd be 7+5. When you're around 12 years old, the coaches all got you into the shower room and taught you how to take a shower. And old Coach Brewster walked in, big hairy guy with this brow ridge bent over from his time in Vietnam. And I turned to my friend James Arthur. I said, "That's Neanderthal man. He stepped right out of our reader. We're taking a shower with him." I hope that his children aren't watching.
Standing, just a quick share, please, for about 5-10 seconds.
Sure, yeah. Whenever you're ready, brother.
Okay, hold on a sec. I'm just going to show you what I'm actually talking about. If you look at, do you see that image there?
Oh, yeah.
It says deer-like mammal was a whale ancestor. Guys, this is SpongeBob University stuff.
Mhm.
There's
SpongeBob University. I love it.
yeah.
Just imagine.
Just imagine. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Just imagine.
Now, again, our challenge to those of you that think we're being too flippant is to look behind me. We want you to be skeptical. The Bible talks about pursuing your doubts, but we don't want you to end up like many of our colleagues that are actually in denial. They're saying, oh, George can talk about all these Neanderthal fossils, and Standing for Truth can talk about how in populations of bacteria it gets worse, not better. Is that the way science works? Let me bring up my next point, which is my favorite part of Origin of Species. It's the final sentence in the final paragraph of the whole book. And let me read it to you. He talks about, it's a long sentence. He talks about variability, the ratio of increase so high as to lead to the struggle of life. This is exactly what Standing for Truth was talking about in those bacteria populations. And he says this, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Oh, wait. Could it be that the Scots are not as evolved as the Saxon Brits? Or maybe the Germans are more evolved than I am. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. Does it directly follow? There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers. Listen to this. Having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. Darwin is tipping his hat to his wife, Emma Wedgwood Darwin, that appreciated his skeptical views, but she wanted to fit in to the Church of England there locally where they were living. So let me make sure I don't lose this here. Originally breathed into a few forms under one, that while the planet has gone on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, then listen to this, have been and are being evolved. The final sentence in Origin of Species is really the only time he ever uses the word evolution. I find that striking. What do you think, George?
Yeah, look, I every time I read something about evolution, I shake my head. But here's a question that came in from one of our own, Jonathan Guzman, says, what does Professor McQueen, excuse me, the phone's ringing. What does Professor McQueen think about the floating forest hypothesis put forth by Dr. Kurt Wise? Is it based, question mark?
Okay. Um, a longtime associate of Dr. Steve Austin is Dr. Kurt Wise. Fascinating creation scientist. He has his PhD from Harvard. Stephen Jay Gould has now passed on to his reward, but Gould was his major professor. Gould, for years and years, wrote an essay every week in a science journal, and he took the name from this quote from Darwin. There is grandeur in this view of life. That's what Gould talked about. So Dr. Wise is a creationist who has modified, in my view, Austin's old idea of floating mats the size of Tasmania, the size of the province of Ontario, the size of the Texans considered a country, but it's actually a state in America called Texas. So you got these huge floating mats. I think that even though Kirk Wise has got his own take on this, we go back to this vocabulary that I'm teaching George here as he's working on his degree in geology.
No, PhD.
We've already gotten one of those from Harvard, so I'll give you one from my university. But at any rate, the idea of coal formation in the past is that, as I said before, you've got peat moss building layer and layer, thousands and thousands of years of peat moss. That's a precursor of coal. You go from peat to bituminous coal to anthracite and so forth. Well, a better explanation, and certainly one that Austin's own research shows, is that the precursor to coal was not autochthonous, sitting there for millions of years. It was allochthonous. It had moved in from another place. Back to you, standing for truth.
And Dr. Steve Austin's predictions were proven correct, by the way, at the example at Mount St. Helens.
Yes. Standing for truth. What's the next one?
Okay, so we got a question here. I don't think we got to this one, but we have been asking a lot of questions for the last 2 hours, so forgive me. So this question is, how could seeds for plants that only grow on limestone in Central American, I'm just reading it word for word, and Cuba survive the flood? Did Noah have a giant seed garden? How did the seeds get from Ararat to Central America?
Okay. Let me give you the answer that I've taught my students over the years. And part of my argument comes from the common evolutionary view of the evolution of mankind. Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, all the rest. They have the idea that people in antiquity were essentially dumb and stupid. I counter-argue with what I call the genius of ancient man. If you go to Machu Picchu in Peru and look at the locality there that was built after the flood, if you look at the pyramids, the great pyramids of Egypt, if you go to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, as I've done, and looked at the temples there, these are remarkable examples of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and how they moved across the world. Keep in mind that no structure like an Egyptian pyramid or a Mayan or Aztec place could have survived the flood. It was catastrophic, leveled everything. So if you find a pyramid, it was built after the flood. So Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth probably had, well, no doubt had on board all kinds of grains that they were feeding the animals in that first few weeks before they went into hibernation. And so they had seeds of corn, they had wheat, they had all kinds of grains from that time. Now, the question from our critic says, well, these types of seeds are now found in Cuba, and other types are shown growing on limestone in other parts of the world. The answer is, so what? We're arguing that from the 8 people that got off the ark, the ancient peoples that are called native peoples, American Indians, the aboriginals of Australia, they all migrated from eastern Turkey throughout the entire world. But they didn't migrate in ignorance. They migrated with purpose. And so Noah turned to his grandson that was headed toward Australia and said, I'm tired of these kangaroos. They're tearing everything up. Take them with you. And so the kangaroos went with that child. The seeds for corn went with that child. The seeds for certain types of wheat went with that child. You look at the descendants of Japheth that ended up as the continental glaciers moved down the centuries after the flood. People look at Neanderthal in the caves in France, and they said, oh, how primitive. Well, as anthropologists have studied old Neanderthal more and more, not only have they found out, like George pointed out, that they were alive and well, they were the rugby players of the post-flood world. They were the football linemen of they were robust men. And these guys were adventuresome. They moved up near this cold weather. Where would the logical place to be to live? They got their wives, they got their children. Oh, I'm going to move in a cave in France that had been eroded by the waters of the Great Flood. I think Michael Ord even gave a talk on this lately. And so they move into these caves. Why? Temperature's constant. You're out of the weather. It's the logical place to live. Neanderthal man didn't knock his redheaded wife in the head and drag her into the cave. She said, you stupid, let's go into the cave. It's the logical place to go with the wives and the children. And what do you find inside the caves? You find remarkable paintings, multicolored. You find evidences of burials, funeral traditions.
Tools.
Every characteristic, tools, thank you. Every characteristic of modern man you find with Neanderthal in those caves. And so that would be my answer about how we end up with some seeds that now grow on limestones in Cuba.
David?
Yes.
Also, seeds float. They can also travel through the air. And a good example is the island of Surtsey. As you know, it's a volcanic island. And within 10 years of its formation, it's now littered with vegetation to the point where they have migrating birds actually nesting on that island. Yeah. So those seeds got there somehow, didn't they?
Yeah, and notice the comment of redefined living here. He says it's a germination event, spreading all kinds of seeds around the world. Some would take root in some places and others would not.
Correct.
And some of the botanists that Dr. Henry Morris contacted in the 1950s when he was writing his book with Whitcomb, some of these botanists actually soaked some seeds for a year in salt water. And I don't know whether they were corn or wheat, but they germinated. And so the fact that you have seeds in bags on board the ark and then seeds that are floating around, it's a good point, isn't it, Standing?
It is a good point, and that was a fantastic, informative answer, Professor McQueen. I always say this, but I'll say it again. I really appreciate what a blessing you are and how informative your answers to these sometimes very technical questions are. So great job. What are your thoughts on this, David? I was curious. So I've heard this many times from critics where they've pointed to their acceptance of global floods. For example, here, Chris in the chat, and I appreciate your comment, Chris. Thanks for being here. He says, Younger Dryas impact event caused a lot of global floods 12 to 13,000 years ago. So to me, they don't want to accept the biblical worldwide flood, but instead they'll accept multiple worldwide floods at different points. Well, I'm curious your thoughts of that.
Well, two thoughts. In September, we need to do a whole section on the Martian geology that's being uncovered and analyzed. Each night, I go online and look at today's evidence from Mars. They're clearly, and I don't know if you've looked at these pictures too, like I have, George, and there's clearly been water on Mars, and it's created cross-bedded units and so forth. But they keep looking and digging and looking and digging for what they consider to be NASA's reason for existence, and that is to find life on other planets. On the basis of what Scripture says, they're not going to find life on Mars. They can dig and scratch. Even the Chinese, well, they'll probably find the coronavirus on Mars. No, it's a little bit of Chinese humor there, but the point is they have a rover on Mars. So how would I answer this about global floods? First, you take the 12 to 13,000 years and you compress that into the reasonable biblical framework. Now, remember that if you take the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, you end up with a 10,000-year-old date. And Dr. Morris and Dr. Whitcomb, if you buy their book and look at some of the appendices, they admit that maybe Usher was wrong and maybe the Earth is 10,000 years or instead of 6,000. But what's the point? It's thousands, not millions. And so you take this evidence of a flood caused by an impact event, and you compress that 13,000 years down to an impact event that either occurred during the time of the flood, or a better example would be an impact that occurred after the flood. These astroblems are found in my home state of Tennessee, and they, no doubt, if they hit as the waters were receding, would have produced a tremendous wave, a tsunami. So we don't doubt that there were meteorite impacts that we can see, these astroblems, as they were called. We just doubt what we call in denial old Earth viewpoint that these are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So will you allow us, Standing for Truth class, to be skeptical about the age of the Earth?
Amen. Well said. Well said.
Can I just add to what Professor McQueen said? And you probably know this, David, that on Mars they found a canyon which is far larger and bigger than the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And the explanation is it may have been caused by something of a biblical type flood. Imagine saying that about a canyon that was found in Mars where there's very little water, surface water on Mars, calling it a biblical event.
Yes.
And just to answer Crimson Air on screen about the KT Bandry and the iridium, I won't spend time on that. There's a complete video that we've done on the Chicxulubs. If you go on there, we answer those questions on iridium layer. So I'm not going to waste my time explaining that again. So please have a search. You'll find the Chicxulub stream that we did. It was only about a month or so ago.
I was going to recommend that.
Yeah.
Now,
Standing
for Truth, may I go ahead and do a 5-minute closure and turn it over to you and George?
Yes, I was just going to recommend that because we are at the 2 hour, 2 hours have flown by. Both you brothers have done a phenomenal job. As always, I'm going to save these questions and we'll have to do another 2 hour Q&A hopefully soon. So
there's a PBS series.
Sorry, David, sorry, before you do your 5-minute closing, can I just take 5 minutes to cover one bit that I get sick and tired of hearing it over and over again because there's observational evidence that disproves it. So
Okay,
standing.
what we'll do, George, what we'll do, brother, is we'll let you have your 5-minute closing. Then we'll allow Professor McQueen, the birthday boy, to have his 5-minute closing, and then we'll call it a night because we'll be just over 2 hours. So go ahead, George.
Can I either share the screen? I promise I won't spend more than 3 minutes on it.
Sure. Go ahead.
The question relates to varves. Okay,
That's good.
You'll see there the old Earth creationists say that the varve formations in the world is the Green River formations of the Western United States. They say it took up to 6 million years. They're saying using the standard varve explanation, that would mean the formation represents over 3 million years of sedimentation. They're saying you get one layer in summer, one layer in winter, so therefore that's why they actually count them to 6 million layers. The claim is young Earth creationists have always sought to tear down the arguments about varves, seeking to undermine the 3 million years that they represent. Now, have a look at those pictures there. That's St. Helens, Mount St. Helens. You can see within 3 hours, those things are varves just there, guys. It didn't take million years to actually deposit those.
Yes.
And here's another observational. This is empirical evidence. You'll see there are 2 core holes that were done at the Lake Sigitsu Lake in Japan. You'll see there that those 2 ash layers, and you see the number of so-called varve layers between them are different. So how could you get 2 different counts of varve layers between the 2 ash layers if they represent a constant deposition? So that's why I just wanted to cover that very quickly. So sorry about the interruption.
That's okay. Those of you that are in the U.S. may have heard this word pronounced varve, and the Green River doesn't represent 3 million years, but as George pointed out, you can have those varves in 3 days. Okay, let me give you my summary for why I think you should be skeptical and pursue your ideas, because Charles Darwin did not. There's a PBS series called The Voyage of Charles Darwin that you can probably get online nowadays, and it's based on his autobiographical arguments, his autobiographical writings. And I'm going to read you something that he wrote in 1839, apparently. Recall that he was on the voyage of the Beagle for 5 years. He spent the last 40 years of his life writing The Origin of Species, which came out in 1859. Here is his autobiographical comments about being on board the Beagle. But I was very unwilling to give up my belief. I feel sure of this, and I can remember often inventing daydreams of old letters from distinguished Romans proving that the Bible was true. But as I was on board the voyage of the Beagle and arguing with the sailors, I found it more and more difficult, given free scope to my imagination, you'll appreciate that, George, to invent evidence that would convince me of the truth of the Bible. Thus, this disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but it was last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and I haven't since doubted that my conclusion was correct. What is his conclusion? I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. What was Darwin's problem? C.S. Lewis called it the problem of pain. Listen to this. For if the Bible's true, the plain language of the text seems to show that men who do not believe, now listen, that would include my father, my brother, and most of my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. This is a damnable doctrine. Pretty profound, I think. Those of us that take our time to argue this on Standing for Truth don't want you to come next week or next month to Darwin's conclusion. The Bible does not contain a damnable doctrine. It contains doctrines that, if you don't see the truth of them, will lead to your damnation. Now, that's a very serious way to end today, don't you think, Standing?
Amen. Amen. Well said. Both of you gentlemen did a great job. 2 hours has flown by. We have Shelley in the chat says, McQueen and George Bond Wednesdays are my favorite. Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us. So both of you have done a phenomenal job in your research and answering these questions, all sorts of questions. So I appreciate you both.
Let me ask you to drop my video. I'll say goodbye. Next week, I'm going to be in the state of Maryland making an educational video about flood geology. So I will not be here next Wednesday, and I'll look forward to coming back after my trip to Maryland. George, we'll put it off for 2 weeks. Go ahead and drop my video, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Enjoy your holiday, David.
Thank you very much.
Happy birthday again, David, and we will be praying for your trip. God bless. Okay, everybody. Well, that was a lot of fun. We are going to save a lot of these questions for another audience Q&A. We'll be having many more of these. We're going to shut it down for the night. Brother George, any final words before we do so?
But always remember, evolution is nothing more than presuppositions supported by vivid imagination, unproven and unverifiable assumptions, biased and subjective interpretations, outlandish speculation and conjecture grounded in untestable hypotheses, which makes evolution no more than just so stories. You have my permission to use that, by the way. I won't copyright it, so use it as much as you like.
I'm going to put it on a shirt, George. That's a shirt I'd like to walk around in. So
it's going to be a big shirt.
Big shirt. Yeah, exactly. I'll just tattoo it. No, I'm just kidding. So great final words. Thank you to the chat. We've got such a great audience. We are blessed with an awesome audience every single week, every single show. So many great comments, very professional and cordial in our live chat. So many great questions as well. So God bless everybody. God bless you all for the kind words. And until we meet again, thank you so much.
Standing, I was hoping we'd get more time to answer some of the things that Robert Rowe mentioned on Bread of Life, the Bread of Life video regarding carbon-14 and the missing isotopes, But unfortunately, we didn't have the time to cover it. But hopefully, in another stream, we might actually go to it and actually just spend some time explaining why he's wrong.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is dedicate a specific show to that topic and correct him on many of the erroneous things he said, and call him out on the epic dodging he did as well. So that'll be fun. We're looking forward to that, guys. So stay tuned. We'll be a lot of videos for everybody to look forward to. So that being said, SFT and George Bond are out. God bless all.
Out.